The Librarian's Final Recommendation. A Miss Marple Mystery, Farrow's Cross, Kent, 1952. Chapter 1. The Unveiling of the East Wing. The bunting had been strung between the lampposts of Farrow's Cross for 3 days running, and 3 days of intermittent Kentish drizzle had left it looking, as Mrs. Ottoline Bracewell remarked rather too loudly to anyone within earshot, like washing that nobody had bothered to bring in. Still, the sun had condescended to appear for the occasion itself, and the small crowd gathered on the gravel sweep before the Farrow's Cross Free Library seemed disposed to forgive the bunting, its limp and faded ribbons. Miss Jane Marple stood a little apart from the main press of villagers, beneath the shade of a horse chestnut that had clearly stood sentinel over this particular patch of green for the better part of a century, and observed the proceedings with the quiet, unhurried attention she generally reserved for knitting patterns and garden pests. She was visiting her old school friend, Eulalie Trent, who had married into Farrow's Cross some 30 years before and never quite left off being astonished by it. "You will find it dreadfully dull, I expect," Eulalie had said, on the drive over from the station the previous afternoon, "after London and your nephew and all his clever friends. We are terribly provincial here. Nothing happens at all, except the library committee, and even that generates more feeling than fact." Miss Marple had murmured something non-committal about preferring places where nothing happened, and had meant it rather more sincerely than Eulalie supposed. In her experience, places where nothing happened were, on the whole, far more interesting than they pretended to be. The occasion before them now was the formal opening of the library's new East Wing, funded, as everyone in the village knew, and as everyone in the village had opinions about, by a legacy from the late Miss Honoria Pelham, who had died 2 winters previous, leaving no relations to speak of, and a great quantity of money to a library she had, by all accounts, visited perhaps 4 times in her life. The new wing housed, among other things, a reading room, a small lending counter for gramophone records, an innovation that Mrs. Bracewell considered faintly American, and a glass display case intended for rotating exhibitions of local historical interest. Presiding over the whole affair, looking flushed with a pride he was visibly trying to disguise as mere civic duty, was Mr. Norris Albright, librarian of Farrow's Cross for the better part of 11 years. He was a tall man, stooped slightly from decades of bending over low shelves, with thinning grey hair combed with great optimism across a freckled scalp, and small, sharp eyes behind wire spectacles that missed remarkably little of what passed before them, whether in the pages of a book or in the conduct of his fellow villagers. "He does love his moment," Eulalie whispered, as Mr. Albright cleared his throat for the 3rd time before the small lectern that had been carried out specially for the occasion. "Poor Norris. He has waited 2 years for this wing. The committee very nearly gave the money to the church roof instead." "Did they?" said Miss Marple with interest. "And who proposed the church roof?" "Reginald Thorne, of course. He proposes the church roof for everything. I sometimes think he has shares in lead." Mr. Albright's speech, when it came, was brief and somewhat halting, full of small jokes about Dewey Decimals that landed with the particular thud reserved for librarian humour, but it was received with genuine warmth. He thanked the Pelham estate, the parish council, and, with a small, almost apologetic smile, those patrons whose particular interests over the years have shown me that a library is not merely a collection of books, but a collection of questions. It was, Miss Marple thought afterward, turning the phrase over as she turned over so many things, a curious thing to say, and curiously emphasized. She noticed that as he said it, his eyes moved, briefly, almost imperceptibly, toward a knot of people standing near the rose-bed. Dr. Hugh Fenwick, the village's general practitioner since shortly after the war. Mrs. Phillida Crewe, who kept the tea shop and sweet counter on the high street, and young Miss Verity Ashdown, who assisted Mr. Albright 3 days a week, and was, by village consensus, a sweet girl, though one does wonder about her people. The ribbon was cut. There was tea in the new reading room, served from a trestle table by the Women's Institute, and a great deal of admiring comment about the new shelving, which was indeed handsome, being of good English oak rather than the deal that made up the rest of the building. Mr. Albright moved among his guests with the slightly anxious geniality of a man unused to being the centre of attention, and not entirely certain he liked it, accepting compliments, refilling cups, and, Miss Marple noted, pausing rather longer than seemed necessary beside Dr. Fenwick, exchanging some low words that ended with the doctor's jaw tightening almost imperceptibly before he turned away to compliment Mrs. Bracewell on her hat. It was a small thing. It might have meant nothing at all. Miss Marple, accepting a cup of tea she did not particularly want from a flustered young WI volunteer, found herself filing it away regardless, in the manner of a woman who had spent 60 years observing that small things very rarely meant nothing at all. The afternoon wore on pleasantly enough. The vicar, the Reverend Adrian Soames, gave a short and mercifully unboring blessing upon the new wing. Colonel Basil Ray, retired, loudly recalled a library he had once used in Poona, to the visible weariness of several listeners. The sun, having done its civic duty, withdrew behind a bank of cloud, and the party began, by ones and twos, to drift toward home and supper. It was Miss Verity Ashdown who found Mr. Albright, perhaps 40 minutes after the last guest had gone, slumped forward over his own desk in the little office behind the lending counter, a half-finished cup of cocoa cooling at his elbow, and a small tin of throat pastilles, the kind he was famous, in a mild way, for sucking constantly, on account of a chronic and much-discussed cough, spilled across the blotter before him. He was, by the time Dr. Fenwick arrived at a dead run not 3 minutes later, already quite beyond any help that medicine, however promptly summoned, could offer. Chapter 2. A cough drop and a cup of tea. The scream that brought half the village running, for Verity Ashdown, ordinarily a composed and sensible girl, screamed quite as thoroughly as anyone might have wished under the circumstances, found Miss Marple still some 20 yards from the library gate, walking back with Eulalie at the comfortable pace of two women who had long ago given up any pretence of hurrying anywhere. "Good gracious," said Eulalie, stopping dead. "That's from the library." By the time they reached the east wing, a small crowd had already gathered, kept at the threshold of the inner office by Dr. Fenwick himself, who stood in the doorway with his sleeves rolled to the elbow and an expression that Miss Marple, watching from the back of the crowd, found professionally appropriate, and yet, she could not quite say why, not entirely convincing. "There is nothing to be done," he said, to the room generally, in the firm, slightly raised tone of a man accustomed to being believed. "I am very much afraid Mr. Albright is dead. It looks like his heart. He has complained to me before of palpitations, and the strain of today's excitement. He never said a word to me about his heart," said Mrs. Bracewell, who considered herself, by virtue of long acquaintance, the village's foremost authority on the medical histories of her neighbours. "Patients do not always confide such things to their friends, Mrs. Bracewell, even when they confide them to their doctor," said Dr. Fenwick, not unkindly, though there was, Miss Marple thought, the faintest edge beneath the words, like a blade kept just out of sight beneath a folded napkin. Inspector Calder of the County Constabulary, summoned by telephone within the half-hour, was a stolid, unimaginative man with the look of someone who had hoped, on a Tuesday afternoon in late September, to be doing nothing more taxing than his garden. He listened to Dr. Fenwick's account, sudden collapse, a known history of heart trouble, the natural strain of a day's excitement upon a man no longer young, and seemed disposed on the whole to accept it. "Tragic, of course," he said, to the small huddle of villagers still clustered in the reading room, unwilling to disperse while there remained anything to be learned. "But these things happen, I'm afraid. A man of his age, all that fuss and bother, well, We'll want a doctor's certificate, naturally, but I don't think there's anything here that need trouble anyone unduly." It was Miss Marple, small, pink, and entirely unremarkable in her grey coat and old-fashioned hat, the sort of elderly lady whom inspectors of all ranks habitually overlooked, very much to their occasional later regret, who noticed, while ostensibly admiring the new oak shelving, that the tin of pastilles upon the desk had not, in fact, spilled. It lay on its side, true enough, but the little brown lozenges that had scattered across the blotter lay in a pattern that suggested they had rolled there with some force, rather than simply tipped from an overturned tin, as though the tin had been knocked or thrown in the last frantic moments before whatever had happened to Mr. Albright had finished happening. She said nothing of this to Inspector Calder, for the excellent reason that she had not yet been introduced to him, and old ladies who volunteer forensic observations to policemen they have not met are, in Miss Marple's long experience, rarely thanked for it. She did, however, mention it, in the mildest and most roundabout fashion imaginable, to Eulalie on the walk home. "Such a quantity of pastilles," she said. "I wonder he kept so many on his desk at once. I should have thought one tin would last a man a very long while." "Oh, Norris went through them like sweets," said Eulalie. "He had a chest, you know, ever since the war. Gas, I believe, though he never spoke of it. Dr. Fenwick prescribed him something special for it. Verity used to fetch his pastilles from the surgery dispensary for him, because the chemist in the next village charged twice what Dr. Fenwick did for the same thing." "How very economical of him," said Miss Marple, and let the subject drop, though she did not, in her own mind, let it drop at all. That evening, over a supper of cold ham and a salad that Eulalie apologised for at some length, the talk in the village, for word travels with extraordinary speed in places where, by Eulalie's own account, nothing ever happens, had already begun to take its first shape. By the time Miss Marple retired to the small spare bedroom with its view over the back garden and its slightly damp wallpaper, 3 distinct theories of Norris Albright's death had already reached her second hand, by way of Eulalie's housekeeper, who had heard them at the butcher's: that he had died of his heart, exactly as Dr. Fenwick said; that he had died of the shock of some bad news received that very afternoon, the nature of which nobody could quite specify; and, this from Mrs. Bracewell, predictably, that there was something not at all right about it, though Mrs. Bracewell, when pressed, could offer no firmer foundation for her suspicion than a general sense that quiet men, who kept libraries tidy for 11 years, did not, as a rule, die suddenly without there being something behind it. Miss Marple, lying awake some while later and listening to the wind in the horse-chestnut outside her window, found herself in cautious, private agreement with Mrs. Bracewell, though for rather more specific reasons than Mrs. Bracewell could have supplied. Chapter 3. The Vicar's Hasty Diagnosis. It was the Reverend Adrian Soames, of all people, who first gave voice, gently, almost apologetically, over tea at the vicarage, 2 days after the funeral arrangements had been settled, to the suggestion that something might be amiss. "I don't like to say it," he told Miss Marple, who had been brought along by Eulalie on the strength of a long-standing friendship between the vicar's wife and Eulalie's late sister, "but Norris came to see me, you know, only the week before he died. He wanted to discuss, well, he was rather vague about it, but he wanted to discuss a matter of conscience. A point of moral obligation, he called it. Whether a man was bound to act upon information that had come to him quite by accident, in the course of his ordinary work, if that information concerned a serious wrong done to someone else, long ago." "And what did you tell him?" Miss Marple asked. "I told him that conscience generally knows its own mind, rather better than we are willing to admit, and that if he felt the pull of obligation so strongly as to come and discuss it with his vicar, he had very likely already decided what he meant to do, and wanted only a little moral support in the doing of it." The vicar turned his teacup unhappily in its saucer. "I have wondered since whether I ought to have pressed him further. asked him outright what he meant. But one does not like to pry into a man's conscience, Miss Marple, even when one is paid, in a manner of speaking, to look after it. You could not have known it would matter, said Miss Marple kindly, though I think perhaps it does matter rather a great deal. Did he say anything more? Any name? Any hint of the nature of the wrong he had discovered? Only this, said the vicar slowly. He said that a library, properly attended to, told a man a very great deal about his neighbours, what they read, when they began to read it, and when, very suddenly, they stopped. He said it was extraordinary what people gave away, quite without meaning to, through the books they asked for. Miss Marple set down her own cup with great care, as though it had suddenly become a good deal heavier. What books, I wonder, she murmured, had anybody in Farrow's Cross stopped asking for? Quite suddenly. She put the question, in due course and with no particular urgency, to Verity Ashdown, though it took the better part of a week to arrange, since the library remained closed pending a temporary arrangement with the county service, and Miss Ashdown, grief-stricken and uncertain of her own employment, was not easy to corner without seeming to corner her. Miss Marple managed it eventually over the W.I.'s collection for a memorial wreath, falling into step beside the girl as they walked back from the florist's. "You must have known Mr. Albright's habits very well," she said, by way of opening. 11 years is a long while to work alongside a man. "I'd known him since I was a girl, really," said Verity. "He used to let me sit behind the counter and read while my mother did the shopping, when I was small. He gave me my first job the year I left school, when nobody else would have me." There was something in the way she said would have me that caught at Miss Marple's attention, a small thread left dangling that she resolved, privately, to come back to. "He must have confided in you then, a good deal, about the patrons and so forth." "Not really. Mr. Albright was very correct about that sort of thing. He used to say a librarian who gossiped about borrowing records was no better than a postman who steamed open letters." Verity's mouth twisted, half a smile, half something sadder. But he had been odd, this last month or so, distracted. He took to going through the old registers in the evenings, after I'd gone home, the really old ones, from before the war, that we keep in the cellar for the historical record. I found him down there twice, with the gas lamp burning and dust all over his sleeves, and when I asked what he was looking for, he only said, "Confirmation, my dear. Merely confirmation," and wouldn't say more. "Confirmation of what, I wonder?" said Miss Marple very softly, more to herself than to her companion. "I don't know," said Verity, and there was real distress in her voice now. "I've thought about it until my head aches, Miss Marple, and I can't think what he meant. But I'll tell you one thing odd. The day he died, that very morning before the party, I went down to the dispensary at Dr. Fenwick's surgery to collect his pastilles, same as always. Nurse Hibbert wasn't there, so Dr. Fenwick made them up himself, which he doesn't usually do, being so busy. He seemed in rather a hurry about it. And when I got back, Mr. Albright thanked me very particularly. Said something like, 'Good girl, Verity. Last lot I'll be needing of those, I should think.' Did he say why? I thought he meant his cough was better. But now I wonder." Verity stopped walking altogether, the flowers for the wreath clutched against her chest. "Miss Marple, you don't think, that is, everyone says it was his heart, and Dr. Fenwick is ever so good a doctor, but I think," said Miss Marple, "that it is generally wisest not to think anything at all until one has rather more to think with. But I am very glad you told me about the registers, my dear. Very glad indeed." Chapter 4. Whispers over the hedgerows. Grief in a small village, Miss Marple had observed over the course of a very long life, possesses a curious double character. It is, on one hand, perfectly genuine, and on the other, almost indistinguishable in its outward behaviour from entertainment. Farrow's Cross mourned Norris Albright with sincere feeling and with a relish for speculation that would not have disgraced a county fair. By the end of the first week, no fewer than 4 theories circulated with equal confidence among the village's principal gossips. each championed with a conviction that brooked no contradiction. Mrs. Otterline Bracewell held, with the unshakable authority of a woman who had once read 3 chapters of a detective novel before finding it not to her taste, that Norris Albright had been poisoned by someone connected with the Pelham legacy. For where there is money, Miss Marple, there is always wickedness following close behind, you may depend upon it. Though she could not specify who might have benefited from the librarian's death, the legacy having been bequeathed to the library itself, rather than to any individual. Colonel Ray, predictably, favoured an explanation involving foreign agents, on the grounds that Albright had once, during the war, been attached to some clerical department of intelligence in a minor capacity, and that a man doesn't forget secrets like that, even after years. Somebody might have wanted him silenced. When Miss Marple inquired, with every appearance of innocent curiosity, what manner of secrets a wartime filing clerk might still be carrying 8 years after the peace, the Colonel grew vague and changed the subject to his own exploits in Poona. Reginald Thorne, the solicitor, took the view, expressed at some length to Eulalie over a chance meeting at the bank, that the whole matter was very probably exactly what it appeared. A man with a weak heart, overtaxed by excitement, dying as such men did, and that the village would do well to direct its attention to less morbid concerns, such as the forthcoming flower show. Mr. Thorne, Miss Marple noted, seemed unusually anxious that the matter should be considered closed, and pressed the point with a vigour that struck her as exceeding what the occasion strictly warranted. Mrs. Phillida Crewe, when Miss Marple called at the tea-shop one grey Thursday afternoon, for what she described to herself as a little harmless reconnaissance disguised as scones, offered no theory at all, but wept rather suddenly and unexpectedly into her apron when Albright's name came up, and had to be helped to a chair by her assistant. "Forgive me," she said, when she had recovered herself somewhat. "It is only, he was a kind man, kinder than people knew. He used to come in every Friday for his tea and a slice of the seed cake, and we would talk about books, mostly, though he knew I never had time to read half what he recommended. He had asked me, only the week before, whether I had ever regretted leaving London before I married Mr. Crewe. I thought it an odd question at the time. I think of it rather differently now." "Why differently, Mrs. Crewe?" Miss Marple asked, very gently. But Mrs. Crewe only shook her head, dabbed at her eyes with a corner of her apron, and said that she did not know what she meant, that grief made a woman fanciful, and would Miss Marple care for a second scone, the first batch having come out rather better than the last. Miss Marple accepted the scone, reflecting, as she ate it with every appearance of placid enjoyment, that Mrs. Crewe's tears had seemed to her a good deal more particular and a good deal less general than grief for a kindly customer usually produced. There had been, in the question Mrs. Crewe reported, had she ever regretted leaving London, before she married, the unmistakable shape of a man approaching a delicate subject sideways, the way one might approach a nervous horse, gently, and from an angle calculated not to alarm. It was on her way back from the tea-shop, walking slowly along the hedgerow path that ran behind the church, that Miss Marple encountered Dr. Fenwick himself, returning from a house call with his black bag swinging at his side, and his expression, for a man whose patient had died so recently and so publicly, remarkably untroubled. "Miss Marple, isn't it? Mrs. Trent's friend." He smiled, and it was, she had to admit, a perfectly pleasant smile, the smile of a competent professional man at ease with himself and his place in the world. "A sad business, that, at the library. You'll have heard all about it, I expect, staying with Eulalie. The village does love to talk." "It does indeed," Miss Marple agreed. "Though I confess, Dr. Fenwick, I had not realised poor Mr. Albright suffered from heart trouble. He seemed, when I observed him at the opening, in remarkably good spirits. Excitement can disguise a great deal, even from the sufferer himself," said Dr. Fenwick smoothly. "I had been treating him for some months. A man of that age, working long hours, climbing those library steps a dozen times a day. It takes its toll, however robust a man may appear. I only wish I had insisted he rest more. One always wishes that, afterward. Of course, said Miss Marple. One always does. She smiled at him with what she hoped was perfect mildness, and continued on her way, while Dr. Fenwick, swinging his bag, continued on his. And if either of them found anything in the encounter worth further private reflection, neither permitted the slightest trace of it to show. Chapter 5. The Constable's Tidy Theory. Inspector Calder, it transpired, was a man who liked his cases finished by Friday wherever possible, and Norris Albright's death, heart failure, certified by a respected local practitioner, witnessed by a dozen people who could attest to the deceased's exertions that afternoon, presented itself to him as exactly the kind of matter that ought to be finished by Friday. "I don't say there's nothing in it," he told Sergeant Bowman, his subordinate, on the Wednesday following the death, as the two of them sat in the small police house, reviewing what little there was to review. "But you tell me, Bowman, what's the alternative? A village librarian, no enemies that anyone can name, no money to speak of beyond his pension, a respectable life if ever I saw one. Who'd want him dead, and why?" "There's the business of those old registers, sir," said Bowman, who had picked up the detail from his wife, who had heard it from Verity Ashdown's mother. "The girl says he'd taken to poring over them late at night, looking for something. Old men get peculiar in their habits," said Calder. "My own father took to counting his shirt buttons every Sunday, last years of his life, and there was nothing sinister in that beyond old age catching up with him. I dare say Albright had taken some notion into his head about local history. These bachelor types often do, with too much time and too few distractions. It doesn't make a murder out of a heart attack, Bowman." It was a view, Miss Marple reflected when she heard of it second-hand, for very little passed in Farrow's Cross that did not eventually reach her, by one circuitous channel or another, that had a certain rough justice to it. Inspector Calder was not a stupid man. He was simply a man disposed, by temperament and by the press of other duties, to accept the simplest explanation that the available facts would support, and to resist, with the natural caution of the overworked, any suggestion that matters might be more complicated than they appeared. It fell, therefore, to Miss Marple, though she would have been the very last person to put it in such grandiose terms, to attend rather more closely to the small inconsistencies that the inspector's tidy theory required him to overlook. There was, for one thing, the matter of the pastilles themselves, which Miss Marple had not forgotten, and which she now contrived, with the elaborate casualness of a woman merely curious about local pharmacy practice, to raise with Nurse Hibbert, Dr. Fenwick's surgery nurse, whom she encountered at the Church Flower Rota meeting. "I understand poor Mr. Albright's pastilles were made up specially," she said. "How very thorough of Dr. Fenwick, to dispense them himself rather than leaving it to the chemist." "Oh, that's nothing unusual, Miss Marple," said Nurse Hibbert, a brisk, sensible woman of 50, who plainly regarded gossip as beneath her professional dignity, though not entirely beneath answering a direct question. "Dr. Fenwick always made up Mr. Albright's lozenges himself," said the formula needed a delicate hand, on account of some sensitivity Mr. Albright had to one of the common binding agents. "I was away that particular morning, visiting my sister in Maidstone, so I can't say exactly what he put in them that day, but it would have been the usual mixture, I'm sure. He's most particular about his dispensing, is Dr. Fenwick. Keeps his own poison register and everything, very correct, though between you and me I sometimes think he's a shade too particular. Locks that dispensary cupboard like it held the crown jewels, and won't have anyone but himself with a key to it." "How very conscientious," said Miss Marple. "And has Dr. Fenwick been with you long, Nurse Hibbert?" "I had understood the previous doctor retired some years ago." "Old Dr. Mallow, yes. Must be 9 years since Dr. Fenwick took over the practice. Just after the war, that was. Came very highly recommended, I believe, though I don't recall ever seeing his references myself. That would have been a matter for the parish council and the old medical officer, not for me. Nurse Hibbert glanced at the clock above the vestry door and began gathering her things. I must get on, Miss Marple, or I shall be late for surgery hours. But I shouldn't worry yourself about Mr. Albright's pastilles, truly. Dr. Fenwick is the most careful man with a prescription I've ever worked under. Too careful, if anything. Miss Marple thanked her and walked home slowly, turning over the phrase too careful, if anything with the particular attention she reserved for remarks that were intended as praise, and yet, upon examination, suggested something rather different. A man who locked his dispensary cupboard like the crown jewels and permitted no one else a key to it was, after all, a man who could be entirely certain that nothing irregular discovered in that cupboard could be traced to any hand but his own, which was either the mark of an exceptionally conscientious physician or the mark of something considerably less reassuring. It was, she thought, a distinction well worth keeping in mind, even, perhaps especially, when nobody else in Farrow's Cross appeared inclined to make it. Chapter 6. A Card Left Between Pages. It was Verity Ashdown, returning to the library under the temporary supervision of a Mrs. Tipton sent down from the county service, who made the discovery that altered, however slightly, the entire shape of the investigation. The library had remained shut for 9 days, awaiting the county's decision on what was to be done with it, pending the appointment of a permanent successor, and Mrs. Tipton's first task, upon taking up her temporary duties, had been to set the returned books trolley to rights, since several patrons had continued posting books through the letter slot, even while the building stood closed. It was in one such returned volume, a slim, unremarkable history of Kentish church architecture, borrowed, according to the ticket in its pocket, by Colonel Ray some 3 weeks previously and posted back through the slot the very day after Albright's death, that Verity found, tucked between pages 114 and 115, a small recommendation card of the kind Albright had been in the habit of slipping into books he thought a particular patron might enjoy, with a brief handwritten note suggesting some related title. This card, however, bore no recommendation of any title at all. It bore, in Albright's small, precise hand, a short sequence of words that meant, to Verity, nothing whatsoever, and that she brought directly to Miss Marple, having formed, over the preceding days, the not unreasonable conviction that Miss Marple was a person to whom such things ought to be brought. The card read, F, not Poona, Tipperary, 38. Ask the Lancet, not the Ledger. N.A. I haven't the faintest idea what it means, said Verity, turning the card over, as though the reverse might offer some clarification, which it did not, being entirely blank. F could be anybody. Half the village starts with F. And Tipperary, that's in Ireland, isn't it? I didn't know Mr. Albright had any connection with Ireland. Miss Marple took the card and studied it for a long moment in silence, the church architecture book open on her lap, before she spoke. I think, she said slowly, that this card was never meant for Colonel Ray at all, my dear. I think Mr. Albright tucked it into this particular book because it was a book he knew would not be returned for some while. Colonel Ray is not, I imagine, a fast reader of ecclesiastical architecture, and because a returned library book is, on the whole, one of the very last places anybody would think to search for a document a man wished to keep safely, and yet not destroy. A sort of insurance, you might say, left where it would surface eventually, but not at once. But what does it mean? I think, said Miss Marple, that F stands for a name, and that the note refers to some discrepancy Mr. Albright had discovered, some inconsistency between an account a person had given of themselves, perhaps involving Poona, which I understand is a favourite subject of the Colonel's reminiscence, and some other account, involving a place called Tipperary in the year 1938. And I think the Lancet, not the Ledger, is an instruction to look to medical records rather than to financial ones for confirmation, She looked up at Verity with an expression of mild, troubled thoughtfulness. "Did Mr. Albright, to your knowledge, ever request, on behalf of any patron, materials from a medical library, or correspond with any medical institution?" Verity frowned, casting her mind back. "There was something, about 6 weeks ago, I think. He wrote away to a college in London. I addressed the envelope for him, so I remember it, though I never asked what was in the letter. The Royal College of Physicians, I think it was, or Surgeons. I can't be perfectly sure which." "And did a reply come?" "Yes, about a fortnight later. A thickish envelope. He took it straight into his office and I never saw what was in it, but he seemed different after that, quieter, preoccupied. That was when he started going through the old registers in the evenings." Miss Marple sat for a long moment with the card resting on her open palm, the small architecture book closed now beside her. "I think, my dear," she said at last, "that we ought to consider, very carefully, who in this village has ever served abroad. In India, as the Colonel is so fond of recalling, or elsewhere, and whose history, before they came to Farrow's Cross, might not bear quite the close examination that a careful and curious librarian, with access to old newspapers and professional registries, might be inclined to give it. I think it would also be worth our while, though I confess I scarcely like to suggest it, to discover a little more about Dr. Fenwick's career before the war, and the precise circumstances under which he came to take up Dr. Mallow's old practice 9 years ago. You don't think—" Verity's hand flew to her mouth. "Dr. Fenwick? But he's the kindest man, Miss Marple. He sat up half the night with my mother when she had her pneumonia, 2 winters back, and never sent a bill for it." "I think," said Miss Marple, with great gentleness, "that kindness and innocence, however much we should wish them to go together, are very far from being the same thing, my dear. And I think it would be wisest, for the present, if you said nothing of this card to anyone at all, not to Mrs. Tipton, not to your mother, and certainly not to Dr. Fenwick himself. Could you manage that, do you think?" Verity, white-faced but resolute, said that she could, and did. Chapter 7. The Society for Genealogical Curiosities. There existed, in the county town some 8 miles distant, a small and earnest society devoted to genealogical and antiquarian research, of which, as Miss Marple discovered through the simple expedient of asking Eulalie, who knew everyone and everything within a 15-mile radius, the late Norris Albright had been, for some years, a quiet and faithful member. "He used to attend their meetings the 2nd Tuesday of every month," Eulalie said, over breakfast. "Caught the early bus, came back on the last one. I always thought it a curious hobby for a man with no family to speak of. What was he tracing, I used to wonder, with nobody to trace it for? But there, people do take up the strangest pursuits in their later years. My own husband collected matchbox labels for a decade and never explained why." It seemed to Miss Marple worth the small inconvenience of the bus journey to attend, the following Tuesday, a meeting of the Society for Genealogical and Antiquarian Curiosities, for so it grandly styled itself, though it met above a stationer's shop, and numbered perhaps 14 members in total. She presented herself as a visitor with a general interest in family history, which was true enough as far as it went, and was received with the particular warmth that small, slightly obscure societies reserve for any sign that the wider world has noticed their existence. It was the Society's secretary, a Mr. Pelling, retired from the County Records Office, who proved most useful, once Miss Marple had steered the conversation, with patient and apparently aimless meandering, toward the subject of Norris Albright. "Sad business, that," said Mr. Pelling, shaking his head. "Useful man to have in a society like ours. Albright knew his way round a parish register better than half the professionals I worked alongside for 30 years. He'd been working on something rather particular these last few months, as a matter of fact. Asked me to help him trace the service records of a medical officer who'd served in India before the war. Wanted to know whether the man had returned home afterward, and where he'd gone. Miss Marple's interest, though she took care to keep it expressed no more strongly than polite curiosity, sharpened considerably. Did he say why he wished to know? Not in so many words. He was cagey about it, truth be told. Not like him at all. Usually he was the most open of fellows about his little researches. But he did let slip, the last time I saw him, that he'd had a most extraordinary piece of luck. Said he'd written to a medical college in London asking after the qualifications of a particular practitioner, expecting nothing much to come of it, and had received back a reply that changed the whole complexion of the matter, as he put it. Wouldn't say more than that, except that he meant to be very sure of his ground before he did anything that might do an innocent man a serious injury, if I have got hold of the wrong end of the stick. Did he mention a name? The medical officer, I mean, or the doctor he had written about? Mr. Pelling considered. Not the doctor, no, but the medical officer he asked me to trace. That I do remember, because it's not a common name. Calloway. A Dr. Aubrey Calloway, who served with a hospital unit in India in the middle 30s, and who, this was the curious part, Miss Marple, appeared to have simply vanished from every official record after the year 1938. No further postings, no return passage logged under his own name, nothing at all, as though he had stepped off the edge of the world. And did Mr. Albright form any theory as to what had become of him? He said Mr. Pelling slowly, clearly turning the conversation over in his memory with the same care Miss Marple was bringing to it now, that a man does not vanish from every record there is, all in the same year, unless he has very particular reasons for wishing not to be found, and that the likeliest reason, in his experience of such things, was that the man in question had got into some trouble, of a kind serious enough to make his own name a liability to him, and had quietly become somebody else. The bus journey home gave Miss Marple ample time to consider this, and by the time Farrow's Cross church spire came into view above the hedgerows, she had arrived at a working hypothesis that she found, on the whole, both extremely plausible and extremely uncomfortable, for it pointed with a clarity she would have much preferred to avoid, toward a man whose professional kindness had been amply and publicly demonstrated across 9 years of devoted service to a village that had taken him entirely, and apparently mistakenly, on trust. Chapter 8. Old Newspapers, Older Secrets. The free reading room of the county library, the proper county headquarters, some 12 miles off, rather than the small parish branch at Farrow's Cross, kept a tolerably complete file of back numbers of the Times and several professional medical journals, and it was here, on a wet Thursday with Eulalie's car, borrowed for the purpose, that Miss Marple spent the better part of a day among the bound volumes for the years 1936 to 1939, while the rain drummed steadily against the high arched windows and a young assistant brought her, at intervals, fresh stacks of dusty volumes with an expression of polite bewilderment at what an elderly lady might want with quite so many of them. She found what she was looking for in the late spring of 1938, a brief item, tucked well back among the county news, reporting the findings of a coroner's inquest into the death of a young woman, the wife of a prosperous farmer near Tipperary, who had died under chloroform administered, the inquest found, with insufficient care, by a Dr. Aubrey Calloway, attending in place of the family's regular physician, who was himself indisposed. The jury had returned a verdict of misadventure, but the coroner's remarks, reproduced at some length, had been pointed in their criticism of Dr. Calloway's conduct, in particular his apparent state of intoxication at the time of the procedure, attested to by 2 nurses present, and his subsequent attempt to alter his own notes on the case after the patient's death had become apparent. The medical council, the report noted, had subsequently struck Dr. Calloway from the register, and he had, according to a final brief paragraph some weeks later, left the district, his present whereabouts unknown. It was a small story, soon buried beneath larger ones. The gathering clouds over Europe occupied a great deal more newsprint that spring than the disgrace of one provincial doctor, and Miss Marple did not imagine that more than a handful of people in England now living would recall it at all, had not a curious and conscientious librarian, helping some patron trace an unrelated family connection, happened to follow a thread of society research back to a name that did not quite match the man it was meant to describe. She found, with a little further searching among the medical journals, a photograph, small, blurred, reproduced alongside an obituary notice for an entirely different and unrelated Dr. Hugh Fenwick, who had died of fever at a mission hospital in Malaya in the autumn of 1938, having served abroad with conspicuous dedication and no family remaining to claim his effects or correct, in later years, anybody who chose to make use of his unblemished name and his entirely genuine medical qualifications, obtained at a different college from the one Aubrey Calloway had attended, and never tainted by any inquest whatsoever. The resemblance, in the smudged photograph, between the dead Dr. Fenwick and the living Dr. Fenwick of Farrow's Cross was impossible to judge with any certainty after 14 years and the ordinary changes that time works upon a man's face. But the timing, Miss Marple reflected, closing the bound volume with great care, was suggestive in the extreme. A disgraced doctor vanishes from every record in the spring of 1938. A genuine doctor of almost exactly the right age dies, unmourned and unclaimed, abroad that same autumn. And 9 years later, a Dr. Hugh Fenwick, bearing excellent if somewhat vaguely sourced credentials, arrives to take up a comfortable rural practice in Kent, where nobody has any particular reason to write away to the Royal College of Physicians and inquire too closely into matters that a village, on the whole, prefers to take on trust. It explained, she thought, returning the volumes to the assistant with profuse and entirely genuine thanks, a very great deal. It explained why Norris Albright, having stumbled upon the discrepancy through nothing more sinister than his own habitual thoroughness, had gone to his vicar in a state of troubled conscience rather than directly to the police, uncertain whether he had hold of a genuine wrong or merely a coincidence of names. It explained the card left, like an insurance policy, between the pages of a book that would not soon be opened. It explained, too, though this was the conclusion Miss Marple arrived at with the least satisfaction and the greatest reluctance, precisely why a man with Dr. Fenwick's particular and very specific professional skills might have found himself, on the morning of the East Wing's opening, dispensing a tin of cough pastilles with his own hands, in the unaccustomed absence of his nurse, to a patient who had unknowingly written away, 6 weeks before, for the one piece of correspondence in the world capable of unmaking him entirely. It did not, however, explain everything, and Miss Marple, folding her umbrella as the rain finally eased on the drive home, found herself troubled by one detail in particular that refused to fit quite as neatly as the rest, namely, that a man clever enough to have maintained a false identity, undetected, for 9 years, ought surely to have been clever enough to dispose of an inconvenient librarian by some means a great deal less likely to attract a careful old lady's attention than a hastily and rather conspicuously poisoned tin of throat pastilles. Chapter 9. The Doctor's Steady Hands. It was Inspector Calder, somewhat to his own visible discomfort, who was obliged to revisit his tidy theory the following week, when the police surgeon's belated report on certain samples taken, almost as an afterthought, at Calder's own slightly reluctant insistence, after a quiet and very carefully worded conversation with Miss Marple that he would have been hard-pressed to explain to his superiors as proper police procedure. From the remaining pastilles in Norris Albright's tin came back showing unmistakable traces of aconitine, a swift and notoriously difficult-to-detect poison derived from monkshood, available to any physician with a reasonably well-stocked dispensary and the knowledge of how to use it. "Well," said Calder heavily, setting the report down on his desk and regarding it as though it had personally inconvenienced him, which in a sense it had, That puts a rather different complexion on things." "It does indeed, Inspector," said Miss Marple, who had been permitted to remain in the room on the strength of Eulalie's late husband having once been a magistrate, a connection she employed with a discretion that bordered, she privately admitted to herself, on outright manipulation. "Aconitine," said Calder, turning the word over with distaste, as though it tasted unpleasant even to pronounce. "Not the kind of thing your ordinary poisoner keeps about the house, Miss Marple. That's a doctor's poison, or a chemist's. Mimics heart failure something dreadful, the surgeon tells me, which is exactly why Dr. Fenwick's first diagnosis went unquestioned for as long as it did. No wonder he was so confident about the heart business. He'd know better than anyone how the symptoms would present." "He would indeed," Miss Marple agreed. Inspector Calder looked at her for a long moment, with the particular expression of a practical man forced, against considerable inclination, to take seriously a suggestion he would much rather have dismissed. "You think it's Fenwick, then? Plainly." "I think," said Miss Marple with care, "that it would be most unwise to think anything plainly, Inspector, before we have very much more to go on than supposition, however well-founded the supposition may seem. Dr. Fenwick had the means, certainly, and very possibly the motive, though that motive is not yet proven, only suspected. But he is not, I think, the only person in Farrow's Cross with secrets they would prefer Mr. Albright's curiosity had not disturbed. Mrs. Phillida Crewe wept most particularly when his name was mentioned, and spoke of a question he had put to her about regretting her life before her marriage. Mr. Reginald Thorne has been remarkably eager that the matter be considered closed, for a solicitor with nothing in particular to hide, and Colonel Ray's book, the very book in which the card was found, suggests at the least that Mr. Albright associated him, however indirectly, with the matter he was investigating. You don't think Ray did it? I think it most unlikely, since the card itself appears to clear him of the suspicion it might otherwise raise. It speaks of "not Poona," which suggests Mr. Albright had already satisfied himself that the Colonel's own reminiscences, tedious as they undoubtedly are, were perfectly genuine, and that the discrepancy lay elsewhere. But I should not like to discount any of them entirely, Inspector, not yet. It is a great mistake, in matters of this kind, to fix one's suspicion too early upon the most obvious answer, however strongly the evidence may seem to point that way. The most obvious answer is very often correct, but it is precisely when it is not correct that the gravest injustices are done. Calder rubbed his chin, looking, for the first time since Miss Marple had made his acquaintance, genuinely uncertain of his ground. "What would you have me do, then?" "I should continue, for the present, to treat Dr. Fenwick exactly as you have always treated him, with the courtesy and confidence the village extends to its physician, and no outward sign whatsoever of suspicion. A man who believes himself unsuspected behaves very differently from a man who knows himself watched, Inspector, and we shall learn a great deal more from the former than we ever should from the latter. In the meanwhile, I think it would be most instructive to discover, as discreetly as may be managed, whether Dr. Fenwick possessed, on the morning of the library opening, any particular reason to know that his nurse would be absent from the dispensary, and that the task of making up Mr. Albright's pastilles would therefore fall to him alone. It was a small point, and Calder, writing it down in his notebook with the air of a man humouring an eccentric old lady against his better judgment, did not at first see its full significance. Miss Marple, watching him write, reflected, not for the first time in a long career of being underestimated by precisely such men, that its significance would very likely become a great deal clearer to him in due course, and that there was, on the whole, no particular hurry about explaining it to him now. Chapter 10. A Visit to Brackenbury Hall. It seemed prudent, in the meanwhile, to give some attention to the alternative possibilities Miss Marple had raised, if only to clear the ground and confirm, to her own satisfaction, if not yet to Inspector Calder's, that the truth lay precisely where the weight of evidence already pointed, and not in some more comfortable direction that mere reluctance to suspect a popular and useful village doctor might otherwise have tempted her to prefer. Colonel Basil Ray received Miss Marple and Eulalie at Brackenbury Hall, a handsome if somewhat shabby Georgian house that the colonel occupied alone but for an elderly manservant, and a quantity of regimental memorabilia arranged with more enthusiasm than taste, with the bluff hospitality of a man delighted by any audience willing to hear his stories through to their conclusion. "Poona," he said, when Miss Marple raised the subject with what she hoped was convincing casualness, professing an interest in his service history sparked by a nephew posted there during the war. "Ah, now, there's a station that's seen some changes. I was there from 34 to 37, mind, attached to the supply and transport. Nothing glamorous, you understand, not like the cavalry chaps like to make out, but solid, necessary work." He talked, at very considerable length and with the unmistakable relish of a man for whom these years represented the high water mark of an otherwise unremarkable life, about depots and requisitions, and the iniquities of a particular quartermaster, and Miss Marple, listening with patient attention, and steering him, by degrees, toward the subject of medical officers attached to the same district, confirmed within 20 minutes that the colonel's reminiscences, however tedious, bore every mark of perfect authenticity, down to small, unglamorous, entirely unverifiable details that no impostor constructing a false history would have troubled to invent. "Did you ever come across a Dr. Calloway in your time out there?" she asked at last, watching his face with some care. The colonel frowned, genuinely puzzled rather than alarmed. "Calloway? Doesn't ring a bell, I'm afraid. Plenty of medical officers came and went. Wasn't my department, you understand. Why do you ask?" "Oh, merely a name that came up in some old papers I was looking through," said Miss Marple vaguely, and allowed the conversation to drift toward the flower show, satisfied that whatever Norris Albright's card had meant by its reference to Poona, it had been intended only to eliminate the colonel from suspicion, not to implicate him. The visit to Reginald Thorne's office in the village proved, by contrast, considerably more illuminating, though not in the direction Miss Marple had half expected. The solicitor, when she called upon the pretext of revising her own will, a pretext that had the considerable advantage of being entirely true, since a woman of Miss Marple's years did well to keep such matters current, proved nervous to the point of visible perspiration the moment the conversation touched, even glancingly, upon Norris Albright. "A great loss to the village," he said, mopping his brow with a handkerchief that had plainly seen this duty several times already that morning. "A very great loss. I do wish, Miss Marple, that people would simply accept it for the sad accident it was, and not go stirring up. That is to say, not go speculating in ways that can only cause distress to those of us who valued his friendship." It took, in the end, very little further pressure. Applied, Miss Marple was the first to admit privately, with a degree of gentle ruthlessness that she did not entirely enjoy exercising upon so transparently anxious a man, to establish that Mr. Thorne's anxiety had nothing whatsoever to do with murder, and a very great deal to do with a sum of trust money, belonging to an elderly client now deceased, that he had borrowed against some years previously to cover gambling debts incurred at a discreet club in Maidstone, and had been quietly and gradually repaying ever since, in terror that any close examination of the village's affairs, any stirring up, as he put it, might bring the irregularity to light before he had finished making good the shortfall. "Mr. Albright never knew of it, so far as I am aware," he admitted at last, wretchedly, "but I have lived these 18 months in dread that somebody would discover it, and when he died so suddenly, and people began to talk of foul play, I confess my first thought was entirely for myself, and how readily suspicion might fall in my direction if anyone began examining the village's secrets too closely. It is not a thought I am proud of, Miss Marple, but there it is." Miss Marple, who had rather expected something of this kind, assured him with perfect sincerity that she had no intention of mentioning the matter to anyone, provided the repayments continued. A piece of moral latitude she justified to herself on the grounds that Mr. Thorne's sin, however real, was entirely unconnected with the death she was investigating, and that exposing it now would serve no purpose beyond adding one more ruined reputation to a village that had quite enough sorrow on its hands already. It left, when she had finished her morning's calls and walked home through a fine, persistent drizzle that Eulalie's umbrella did only partial justice to, one suspect eliminated by the unimpeachable authenticity of his own tedious reminiscences, one suspect exposed as guilty of an entirely unrelated and rather pathetic deception, and the original and far graver suspicion resting exactly where it had rested before, upon a man whose steady, well-practiced hands had, for 9 years, healed the sick of Pharaoh's Cross, with every appearance of genuine and disinterested kindness. Chapter 11. The Assistant's Hidden Ledger. It remained to satisfy herself, as thoroughly as discretion permitted, regarding the third loose thread that had presented itself. The curious remark Verity Ashdown had let fall, on their first walk together, about nobody else having "would have me" when Albright gave her employment, and the tears Mrs. Crewe had shed over a question about regretting her life before marriage. The two threads, Miss Marple suspected even before she had properly examined either, were likely to prove connected, and a quiet word with Eulalie's housekeeper, a formidable repository of village history stretching back the better part of 4 decades, confirmed the connection with rather more directness than Miss Marple had quite anticipated. Verity Ashdown's mother was never married to her father, the housekeeper said, lowering her voice though there was nobody else in the kitchen to hear it. Common knowledge now, though it was a dreadful scandal in its day. Phillida Crewe, that was, before she became Mrs. Crewe, and a young man from London she'd been keeping company with one summer, years before she settled down and married Mr. Crewe respectable-like. The girl was sent to be raised by an aunt for some years, and only came back to live with her mother properly once Mr. Crewe had passed on and the scandal had gone cold, as such things do, given time enough. Most folk in the village know it, in a vague sort of way, though it's not the kind of thing anybody mentions to Mrs. Crewe's face, not these 20 years past. This explained, Miss Marple reflected, both the tears and the remark about regret, and explained also, with a poignancy that touched her rather more than she had expected, Norris Albright's question to Mrs. Crewe about whether she had ever regretted leaving London before her marriage, a question that had nothing whatsoever to do with Dr. Fenwick's false identity, and everything to do with a kindly man's private, gentle curiosity about an old friend's old sorrow, perhaps even, though Miss Marple could not be certain of this, and did not think it mattered greatly to the matter in hand, the tentative, late-flowering possibility of something warmer between two people who had each, in their separate ways, spent a great many years alone. It was, in short, precisely the kind of small, sad, entirely human secret that a village accumulates in great quantities over the years, without any of it amounting to motive for murder, and Miss Marple, confirming as much through a brief and carefully sympathetic conversation with Verity herself, who admitted the truth of her parentage with the weary relief of a young woman glad, for once, to have it spoken of plainly rather than whispered behind her back, crossed both Mrs. Crewe and her daughter off her mental list of persons whose secrets bore any relation whatsoever to the matter of the poisoned pastilles. "He was kind about it," Verity said, when Miss Marple gently raised the subject. "Mr. Albright, I mean. He never once made me feel ashamed of it, not in 11 years, though plenty of others did, when I was younger. I think that's partly why I loved working for him so much. He never judged anybody for what they couldn't help, only for what they chose to do once they knew better." It was, Miss Marple thought, an epitaph as fitting as any the man was likely to receive, and one that threw into still sharper relief the cruelty of his death at the hands of a man whose entire false existence rested upon precisely the kind of judgment Albright had so carefully withheld from a young girl's accident of birth, and so much less carefully withheld, in the end, from a stranger's accident of disgrace. It was that same evening, walking back from the vicarage where she had gone to return a borrowed book, and found herself drawn once more into conversation with the Reverend Soames about Albright's troubled visit some weeks before his death, that Miss Marple received the piece of intelligence that finally, and rather alarmingly, escalated the whole affair beyond the careful, patient gathering of background that had occupied her thus far. "I had almost forgotten," the vicar said as she was leaving, "but it has been troubling me since, and I think I ought to mention it. Verity Ashdown came to see me only yesterday, in rather a state. She said she had received an anonymous note pushed through the library letter slot, warning her, in the plainest terms, to stop poking about in old registers and asking questions that are none of her business, or she would go the same way as her employer. She was frightened half out of her wits, poor child, though she tried to make light of it for my benefit." Miss Marple's expression, ordinarily so placid, sharpened at once into something considerably less benign. "Has she told the police?" I urged her to, most strongly. "I do not know whether she has done so yet." "Then I think," said Miss Marple, already turning back toward the village rather than toward home, "that we had better make quite certain she does, without another hour's delay, and that somebody keeps a close and constant eye upon that young woman until this matter is very thoroughly settled." Chapter 12. A Threat in the Letter. Slot Inspector Calder, summoned by telephone within the half-hour, and considerably more alert to the gravity of the situation than he had been a fortnight previously, posted Sergeant Bowman discreetly near the temporary library cottage where Verity Ashdown had been lodging since the death of her employer, for Mrs. Tipton had taken rooms with Mrs. Bracewell, leaving Verity, somewhat to general disapproval, alone in the small cottage attached to the library that had come, by long custom, with the assistant's post. It was a precaution that very nearly came too late. 2 days after the threatening note, Verity, feeling, by her own later account, perfectly safe with the sergeant practically on my doorstep, and consequently rather less careful than she ought to have been, accepted, without particular thought, a small parcel left at the cottage door, addressed to her in handwriting she did not immediately recognize, containing a tin of throat lozenges and a brief unsigned note suggesting that, since Norris always swore by these for a cough, and you have seemed under the weather lately, do try them, a small kindness, in his memory. It was the most extraordinary stroke of fortune. Miss Marple, hearing of it afterward, called it nothing less, though she privately resolved never to rely upon such fortune again if it could possibly be avoided, that Verity, troubled and distracted by everything that had occurred, set the tin aside on her kitchen table without immediately opening it, intending to examine it more closely before deciding whether to trust an anonymous gift in the present circumstances, and that Sergeant Bowman, making his routine evening check at the cottage not 20 minutes later, noticed the unfamiliar tin and asked, with the dogged thoroughness of a young officer anxious to prove himself worthy of his inspector's recent confidence, where it had come from. The lozenges, examined by the same harassed police surgeon who had analysed the first batch, proved to contain a markedly higher concentration of aconitine than those that had killed Norris Albright. A dose, the surgeon observed with some grimness, that would have left very little to chance, and considerably less time for any intervention, however prompt, to save her. "Whoever sent this," Calder told Miss Marple the following morning, in a tone considerably more urgent than any he had yet employed in the case, "knew exactly what killed Albright, knew the manner of it precisely enough to repeat it, and wanted that girl silenced before she could remember or discover whatever it is she knows that frightens them. This isn't supposition any longer, Miss Marple. This is a second attempt at murder, in cold blood, on a girl of 23 who never did anybody the slightest harm. It is indeed, said Miss Marple very gravely, and it tells us a great deal, Inspector, beyond the obvious fact of the sender's continuing danger. It tells us that whoever sent it believed, wrongly as it happens, but believed nonetheless, that Verity Ashdown knew, or might soon discover, something specific enough to be dangerous. And it tells us, I think, that our murderer is growing frightened himself, which is both an encouraging sign in that frightened men make mistakes, and a very alarming one in that frightened men, cornered, sometimes grow desperate enough to attempt almost anything. You're still convinced it's Fenwick? I am very nearly convinced of it, Inspector, though nearly is a word I should like, before very much longer, to be able to discard altogether. The means fit him precisely, only a man with access to a controlled dispensary, and the particular knowledge of how to use aconitine without arousing immediate suspicion could have managed either poisoning, but I should like, before we proceed any further, to be entirely certain, not merely nearly certain, and I think there is one test that may settle the matter beyond any reasonable doubt. What test? Miss Marple considered for a long moment before answering, choosing her words with the particular care she reserved for matters upon which a man's liberty, or worse, might ultimately depend. I think, Inspector, that the surest way to unmask a man living under a false identity is not to confront him directly with the false papers, which a clever impostor will always have some prepared answer for, however thin. It is to test him, instead, upon some small point of genuine, specialized knowledge that the real man, the man whose name he has taken, would certainly have possessed, and that the impostor, trained at a different institution, under different masters, in a different and very possibly inferior tradition, would have no particular reason ever to have learned at all. And you know of such a point? I believe I may, said Miss Marple, with a very little further inquiry of my own, addressed to certain medical gentlemen of my acquaintance, who owe me, as it happens, 1 or 2 small favours from a rather similar matter some years ago. I should be glad, Inspector, of 48 hours before we move against Dr. Fenwick directly. I think it would serve us very ill to confront him prematurely, and find ourselves obliged to release him for want of sufficient proof, only to leave him at liberty, and forewarned, and very possibly desperate enough to try again. Chapter 13. The Society's Quarterly Dinner. The 48 hours Miss Marple had requested were employed, on her part, in a flurry of correspondence, conducted by telephone call to her nephew Raymond in London, who maintained, as a successful novelist of some standing, a wide acquaintance among men of medicine willing, for the sake of an old and valued friendship, to answer an elderly lady's curious questions about the training peculiarities of medical schools in India during the middle 1930s, and, on the part of the village at large, in a steadily mounting unease that no amount of careful police discretion could entirely contain. It was Mrs. Bracewell, predictably, who first noticed and remarked upon the presence of Sergeant Bowman, in plain clothes but unmistakable bearing, stationed with conspicuous lack of subtlety near the library cottage. And it was Mrs. Bracewell who, within a single afternoon's determined circulation among her acquaintance, had succeeded in transforming a quiet police precaution into a village-wide conviction that something dreadful had very nearly happened to that poor Ashdown girl, details unspecified but darkly hinted at. This atmosphere of mounting suspicion presented Dr. Fenwick, who could not have failed to notice it, whatever his private feelings, with a delicate problem of his own management, which he addressed, Miss Marple observed with some interest, by attending the Farrow's Cross Literary Society's quarterly dinner, held that same week at the Crown and Anchor, with every appearance of his usual genial confidence, and by making, over the soup, several pointed and apparently sympathetic remarks about the strain the whole business must be placing upon poor Calder, run quite off his feet, I should imagine, chasing shadows that very likely amount to nothing more than some local lout's idea of a poor joke. "You don't think there's any real danger then, Doctor?" asked Mrs. Bracewell eagerly from across the table. "I think," said Dr. Fenwick, with the easy, measured authority of a man accustomed to reassuring nervous patients, "that grief makes a village fanciful, Mrs. Bracewell, just as it makes individuals fanciful, and that we are all of us, myself included, in some danger of seeing murder and conspiracy in what was very probably nothing more than a tragic accident, followed by a thoroughly unpleasant and cowardly attempt at intimidation by someone with a grudge against the library or against Miss Ashdown personally, for reasons we may never satisfactorily uncover. I should not, were I in Calder's position, allow myself to be drawn into chasing phantoms when there is very likely nothing more sinister at work than spite." It was, Miss Marple thought, listening from 2 seats down with every appearance of placid attention to Eulalie's account of her grandchildren, a performance of really quite remarkable smoothness, confident without being defensive, sympathetic without being excessive, and calculated, with what she suspected was very considerable skill, to plant in the minds of his listeners exactly the comfortable, deflating doubt that a clever man under suspicion would most wish to plant. She found her opportunity to test him a little, in the small and apparently harmless way that had become, over the course of a very long life, her particular and most effective instrument, when the table talk turned, as it eventually did at any gathering that included the vicar, to matters of general interest, and somebody, Miss Marple could not afterward recall who, though she rather suspected she had steered the conversation there herself, with more deliberation than appeared on the surface, raised the curious case, reported recently in the newspapers, of a patient somewhere in the Midlands who had nearly died from a misdiagnosed reaction to a perfectly common anaesthetic, owing to a rare hereditary sensitivity that very few practitioners, outside of certain specialized training, would think to test for in advance. "It is precisely the kind of thing," Miss Marple said, with the mild, faintly apologetic manner of an elderly lady venturing an opinion she fully expected to be corrected on, "that I understand they teach very particularly at certain of the Indian medical colleges, on account of the much greater variety of patient backgrounds one encounters out there. Is that not so, Dr. Fenwick? My nephew mentioned something of the kind to me only the other day, in connection with a friend of his who trained, I believe, at the same college you yourself attended, in Calcutta, was it not? Or perhaps Bombay. I never can keep the two apart in my mind, though I am sure it makes a great difference to those who studied there. It was the smallest of traps, constructed almost entirely of confident-sounding vagueness, and calculated to invite from a man genuinely trained at either institution an easy and natural correction. Bombay, actually, Miss Marple, though it's a common enough confusion, of exactly the kind that the real Dr. Fenwick, whoever and wherever he had actually studied, would have supplied without a moment's hesitation the particular pride of professional men in the specific, unglamorous facts of their own training being, in Miss Marple's long experience, almost universal. Dr. Fenwick's pause before answering was very brief, less than a second certainly, and covered at once by a smooth, practised laugh. But it was, to eyes as carefully trained upon him as Miss Marple's, entirely unmistakable. "Calcutta," he said. "As it happens, Miss Marple, though I confess it's so long ago now that I sometimes have to think twice myself before I'm perfectly sure which city I'm misremembering." It was a perfectly reasonable thing for a tired man to say, and would have satisfied almost anyone else at the table entirely. It did not satisfy Miss Marple in the slightest, for the real Aubrey Calloway, according to the very precise information her nephew's medical acquaintances had furnished her with only that morning, by telephone, had trained not in Calcutta at all, nor in Bombay, but at a small and rather obscure college in Madras, a fact so specific and so thoroughly unglamorous that no man genuinely proud of his own training, however many years had passed, would ever have hesitated over it, or named the wrong city twice in succession, however smoothly he covered the second slip with a laugh. Chapter 14. Miss Marple's Quiet Question. She did not act upon the small triumph of the dinner table at once. A single hesitation over a city's name, however suggestive, was not, Miss Marple reflected on the walk home, the kind of evidence that would persuade a careful prosecutor, let alone convict a man in a court of law, and she had not forgotten her own warning to Inspector Calder against moving prematurely, before the proof was sound enough to withstand whatever clever defence a desperate and intelligent man might construct against it. What she required, she decided, was not merely a slip of memory that might, after all, be explained away, but some reaction altogether more involuntary and more difficult to disguise, the kind of reaction that only genuine fear, rather than mere fatigue, could produce. She arranged it, in the end, with the assistance of Inspector Calder, who had by now abandoned entirely his earlier scepticism and become, somewhat to his own evident discomfort at having been so thoroughly outpaced by an elderly lady of his acquaintance's wife's old school friend, an eager and attentive collaborator in whatever scheme Miss Marple proposed. The scheme itself was simplicity embodied, of the kind Miss Marple most favoured, a small dinner party, given by Eulalie at her own house, ostensibly to thank Dr. Fenwick for his attentive care of the village throughout a difficult fortnight, to which were invited, alongside the doctor himself, Inspector Calder, introduced merely as a friend of my husband's, retired now from the police, though he does still take the most extraordinary interest in old cases, and, seated with deliberate casualness across the table from the doctor, Verity Ashdown, very much alive and apparently entirely recovered from her recent fright. It was over the coffee, the meal otherwise unremarkable and the conversation general, that Miss Marple, folding her napkin with great deliberation, as though the thought had only just occurred to her, turned to Dr. Fenwick with an expression of mild and apparently quite unrelated curiosity. "I had quite forgotten to mention it, Doctor, but I came across the most extraordinary item in the county library only last week, while researching an entirely unconnected matter of family history, an old newspaper report from 1938 of a most distressing inquest in Ireland, concerning a doctor struck off the register for a most unfortunate misadventure with chloroform. I wonder, did you ever come across the case yourself in the course of your professional reading? Calloway, I believe the unfortunate man's name was, Aubrey Calloway." The silence that followed lasted, by Miss Marple's private and entirely deliberate count, perhaps 4 seconds, an eternity, at a small dinner table where every face but one had merely assumed the polite, faintly puzzled expression of people listening to a topic that did not particularly concern them. Dr. Fenwick's face, for those 4 seconds, assumed no expression whatsoever. It went, instead, perfectly and unnaturally still, the careful, practiced geniality draining out of it as completely as colour drains from a face at the sight of sudden and unexpected danger, and it was in that stillness, rather than in anything he subsequently said or did, that Miss Marple read her answer with total and final certainty. "I can't say the name is familiar," he said, after the 4 seconds had passed, his voice recovering its smoothness almost at once, though not, Miss Marple noted, quite quickly enough. One reads so many old cases. In the course of professional study, I shouldn't think it signifies anything in particular. "No," said Miss Marple gently, "I shouldn't think it does. How foolish of me to mention it at all." She did not press the point further. There was, she judged, no need, for Inspector Calder, watching from the foot of the table with the keen, satisfied attention of a man who had finally, after a fortnight's patient instruction, learned to recognize the precise moment at which a quiet question becomes, without ever raising its voice, a verdict. It was Dr. Fenwick himself, rising rather abruptly some 20 minutes later and pleading a forgotten evening call, who brought the small gathering to its premature and Miss Marple privately judged, entirely necessary conclusion. Chapter 15. The Final Recommendation. He did not get as far as his car. Sergeant Bowman, posted discreetly at the end of Eulalie's drive on Inspector Calder's careful instruction, for a man who has just felt the ground give way beneath 9 years of careful deception, is, in Miss Marple's considered opinion, a man who must on no account be left a single unsupervised moment in which to act upon whatever desperate impulse that discovery might produce. Intercepted Dr. Fenwick at the gate, and the doctor, confronted at last with the plain, unavoidable fact of his own exposure, did not trouble to deny it. He stood very still in the lamplight, his black bag clutched against his chest in a gesture Miss Marple found, despite everything, almost unbearably pathetic. And when he spoke at last, his voice had lost every trace of the smooth professional confidence it had carried for 9 entire years, among people who had trusted him absolutely. "How long have you known?" he asked, addressing the question to Miss Marple, who had followed Calder and Bowman out into the drive, drawn by an instinct she could not entirely have explained, that this final scene, whatever shape it took, ought not to unfold without her. With any real certainty, only this evening, Dr. Fenwick, or should I say, Dr. Calloway, though I had suspected it for rather longer than that. He laughed, a short, bitter sound, entirely unlike his usual genial chuckle. "Aubrey, you may as well use the name properly, since it seems I'm to have it back whether I want it or not. I have not heard it spoken aloud in 14 years, Miss Marple. Not once. I had almost, God help me, almost forgotten some days that it was the truer one." "Mr. Albright discovered the deception," Miss Marple said quietly, "through nothing more than his own habitual thoroughness, helping some patron with an entirely unconnected piece of family research. He came to you, I think, before he came to anyone else, gave you, in his own careful, conscientious way, the opportunity to explain yourself, or to set matters right by your own choice, rather than have the truth forced upon you by exposure. That was his manner in everything. He believed, I think, in giving people the chance to act honestly of their own accord, wherever it was possible." "He gave me a fortnight," said Fenwick, Calloway, his voice cracking on the admission. "A fortnight to put my affairs in order," he called it, before he felt obliged, as a matter of conscience, to lay the facts before the medical council and let them decide what was to be done. He was not cruel about it, Miss Marple. That is the bitterest part of all this. He was kind. He said he understood that a man might do desperate things in the aftermath of a single dreadful mistake, made young and made worse by drink, and that he did not relish being the instrument of a second ruin upon the first. But he could not, in conscience, simply look away, not when I held, as he put it, the lives and health of an entire village in hands the law itself has judged unfit to hold them. "And so you killed him," said Inspector Calder flatly, rather than face what he had discovered. "I told myself for 3 days that I would simply leave," said Calloway, with the terrible, exhausted honesty of a man who had carried a secret too long and found, at the moment of its final collapse, an almost physical relief in finally setting it down. "Pack what I could carry, take the morning train, vanish a second time, as I had vanished once before. But I had built something real here. Do you understand? 9 years of genuine work, genuine care for people who trusted me, a life I had come, against every reasonable expectation, to believe I deserved to keep." And when Albright thanked that girl on the very morning of the opening for fetching what he called his last lot of pastils, when I understood that he meant to act the very moment the celebration was over, that very evening perhaps, something in me simply broke, Miss Marple, and I am not now, and was not then, entirely able to explain to you, or to myself, the precise moment at which thinking about escape became, instead, thinking about ensuring there was nothing left to escape from. "And Verity Ashdown?" Calder demanded. "An innocent girl, who knew nothing whatsoever of any of this." I could not be certain what Albright might have told her, Calloway said wretchedly, when I learned she had been going through the old registers herself, after his death, looking, as I believed, for whatever it was that had so preoccupied him these last weeks. I lost what little remained of my reason, and acted from terror rather than calculation. It was, I think, the act of a man already half undone by what he had already done, rather than the act of a man still capable of careful thought. I do not say this in excuse, Miss Marple, only in explanation. I am not by nature a man who finds murder easy. I have found, these past 3 weeks, that it does not grow easier with repetition. If anything, very much the reverse. It was Calder, in the end, who completed the small, grim formality the law required, while Bowman stood ready at the doctor's other side, and Miss Marple, watching the man who had been, for 9 years, the most trusted and best-loved figure in Farrow's Cross, led away into the lamplight toward whatever remained of his own ruined life, found in herself no triumph whatsoever, only the familiar, weary sadness of a woman who had, once again, watched human nature reveal itself in all its terrible, ordinary capacity for both genuine kindness and genuine ruin, very often residing, as she had observed so many times before, within the very same unremarkable heart. Chapter 16. After the closing bell. The library reopened, in the end, a little over 3 weeks after Norris Albright's death, under the permanent charge of a sensible, capable woman named Miss Prynne, sent down at last from the county service, who proved, by general village consent, perfectly adequate to the post without ever quite filling the particular, gentle space its previous occupant had left behind. Verity Ashdown remained as assistant, her position at last secure, and was observed by those who watched such things, and in Farrow's Cross there was always somebody watching, to take a great deal of quiet comfort from continuing to tend the shelves and registers that her old employer had loved so well, as though some part of him might yet be honoured by the simple, faithful continuation of his work. Mrs. Phillida Crewe closed her tea shop for a single day, the week after the trial proceedings began in earnest, and was seen afterward to visit the small, well-tended grave in the churchyard rather more often than strict propriety, in a village so given to observation, might ordinarily have permitted without comment, though it was noted, with a degree of gentleness that surprised even Miss Marple, that nobody in Farrow's Cross troubled to comment upon it at all. Reginald Thorne, whose private shame Miss Marple had elected to keep entirely to herself, was observed to conduct himself thereafter with rather less anxious officiousness, and rather more genuine, quiet diligence than he had shown in some years, whether from relief at having escaped exposure, or from some private resolution prompted by his narrow brush with public disgrace. Miss Marple did not inquire, and did not consider it any longer her business to know. Dr. Aubrey Calloway, for it was under that name, restored to him by the unforgiving requirements of the law that he stood eventual trial, confessed fully and without further evasion to both the murder of Norris Albright and the attempted murder of Verity Ashdown, a confession that spared the village the prolonged ordeal of a contested trial, though not, of course, the far longer ordeal of having admitted, for 9 trusting years, a man capable of such things into the most intimate corners of its daily life. A new doctor was appointed in due course, a younger man with entirely unremarkable and thoroughly verified credentials, who was received by the village with a wariness that Miss Marple privately judged would take a very long while indeed to entirely fade. "I do not think," said Eulalie, on the last evening of Miss Marple's visit, as the 2 old friends sat together over a final pot of tea before the morning train, "that Farrow's Cross will ever quite recover its old, easy trust in things being exactly what they appear. We had always thought ourselves a place where everyone knew everyone else, root and branch, and now we find we did not know our own doctor at all. I think you will recover it, in time," said Miss Marple, "though perhaps a little more carefully than before, which is, on the whole, no bad thing." Villages have a way of healing themselves, Eulalie, just as people do, not by forgetting what has happened, which would be both impossible and unwise, but by learning to carry it alongside everything else that continues, quite ordinarily, to be good and worth keeping. Norris Albright spent his whole life helping people find the right book for whatever trouble they carried, whether they knew quite what they were looking for or not. I like to think that in the end, without ever quite meaning to, he found one last reader the most important recommendation of his career, even if it was, in the final accounting, his own. What recommendation was that? Miss Marple smiled, a small, private smile, and reached for the teapot. "Why, the truth, my dear," she said. "There is no better book in any library, however dearly it may cost the man who finally takes it down from the shelf and dares to read it through to the end." The end.